everyone. Welcome back to Visualizing Abolition, our almost weekly event series created in partnership with the San Jose Museum of Art and the Mary Porter Cesnon Art Gallery. I'm Gina Dent, Professor of Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, and Legal Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Together with Rachel Nelson, Director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, we've conceived this series on art, visual culture, and the radical imaginary as part of the broader urgent discussions about prison abolition currently underway in the US and around the globe. The previous events in the series, from our first conversation in October to last week's conversation with Reginald Dwayne Betts and Craig Haney, are all archived at barringfreedom.org. The website also has information about the related art exhibition, Barring Freedom, at San Jose Museum of Art, which has been temporarily closed due to the pandemic, but will be opening again soon. Our website team deserves special thanks today. Thanks especially to Abram Stern, a brilliant artist and activist whose intellectual contributions and incredible work building the website has been accomplished even as Abram has been evacuated repeatedly due to fires and now floods. Abram has managed to revise the site to make it easier to navigate in the last days, despite the last round of evacuations, and we are deeply grateful. I also want to thank Alex Moore, co-curator of the Barring Freedom exhibition, for creating with Rachel the premise for our extended engagement with art, prisons, and abolition. As Rachel has mentioned in our other events, we have many collaborators and supporters who make these events and the exhibition possible. Too many to name in a timely fashion. But for this event, I do want to give special thanks to Cultural Studies at UC Davis, as well as Cultural Studies at UC Santa Cruz for their support. Now, I'm eager to get to today's conversation with American artists Simone Browne and Ruha Benjamin. I also know we'll have a real treat ahead with a new video from our fabulous music series curated by Terry Lynn Carrington, Music for Abolition. Today's video by Cecile McLaurin-Salvant will premiere as we close, and I'll introduce it more fully then. For now, I'd like to invite our guests to come on camera for our brief introductions. Welcome. American Artist is an interdisciplinary artist whose work is on view in Barring Freedom. American Artist video, installation, and new media works on technology, racism, and policing really helped us formulate the exhibition and these events. They have also exhibited at the Museum of African Diaspora, San Francisco, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and at MoMA PS1. Simone Browne is Associate Professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of the incredibly influential Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness. Browne is also a member of Deep Lab, a feminist collaborative composed of artists, engineers, hackers, writers, and theorists. And finally, Ruha Benjamin is Associate Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. Benjamin is the author of the award-winning book, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, 2019, among numerous other publications. So thank you all for joining us. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. And now I'll turn it over to Rachel, who will moderate the conversation. And remember, if you have questions, enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Rachel will incorporate as many as possible into the discussion. Please enjoy.
Thanks, Gina. I've been looking forward to this conversation too, and thank you all for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to think with you all about how technologies work in subtle and not subtle ways within prisons, policing, and society to normalize what must be acknowledged as the overtly explicit racism and inequalities which are thriving. You differently grapple in your work not only with how technologies shape perception, but also how to resist these systems, how to see and feel otherwise. And I look forward to talking with you today together about your tactics and how we can understand them within an abolitionist methodologies. But to get started, I know you've all made little presentations to begin. So Simone, if you'll get us started.
Thank you. And let me just share. Wonderful. So thank you to Gina, Rachel, and Chloe and the whole Barring Freedom Collective for this opportunity to be in conversation with two of my favorites, Ruha and American. So last month, during the Prisons, Histories, and Erasures panel of Barring Freedom, in her territory acknowledgement, Joanne Barker reminded us to think about the various reciprocities and our responsibilities to each other. And so while I'm coming to you from Toronto today, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa people, some of it is unceded and continues to be contested. But today I'm joining you all as well by way of the video communication platform Zoom. And so Zoom is situated on Muwekma, Ohlone, and Taman lands in what is now San Jose, California. And so in thinking about what it means to build reciprocal and relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated, we should also recognize the infrastructural impacts of the work from home and streaming technologies that we use to do so, like Zoom and other platforms. From the water used to process and transmit data, to the non-renewable energy sources like coal, for example, powering many of the data centers in places like China, Canada, the US, and Australia. In the Notes from Post-Colonial Love poem, Natalie Diaz writes that this poem, an excerpt of which you can see on the slide on the left, is, quote, a small part of how the American Water Museum of my mind exists, she says. Exhibits from the American Water Museum is an interrogation of the colonial violence of environmental extraction, its grief work, its a reckoning, and its aliveness. Diaz asks, have you ever considered your thirst as a weapon? Do you recall in how many instances you didn't care when it was someone else's thirst erupting? In November of last year, Zoom announced that the former Secretary of Homeland Security and former President of the University of California Systems, Janet Napolitano, had been appointed to the company's board of directors. Stock in Zoom closed today at $391.84 a share. That's a gain of almost $10 from yesterday. Last year, it was widely reported that Zoom was censoring certain uses of its platform. By censoring, I mean, for example, disabling host accounts, as well as deleting events on the topic of the occupation of Palestine. An event scheduled for last October and to be hosted by San Francisco State University, a public institution, which featured Palestinian activist Leila Ahmed, was canceled by Zoom in a preemptive move on the assumption that the event just might violate the company's terms of service. Federal anti-terrorism laws, the company said. Cancellations by Facebook and YouTube as well followed suit. So what we have here is the leveraging of third-party platforms when used to host events, teach, work, or otherwise communicate. They can make for really peculiar and also tricky partnerships when these platforms play the role of national security cops, where events and their participants are treated or taken to be threats to the state in an anticipatory manner prior to the live stream event even gets up and running, but instead when the events page gets made. At the same time, Zoom, along with Polycon, Global Tellink, are now some of the communication platforms used by the Colorado Department of Corrections, the Wisconsin DOC, the Pennsylvania DOC, and others. In a move and using the words of Zoom copy that you can see on the screen here, to save time and increase public safety with video parole hearings, arraignments, prison visits, and witness testimony. And I use Zoom's words here deliberately to point to the work of tech washing. That being a form of PR relationship spin, where technology is marketed and then sold as a solution to the problem, but in a way that's misleading when it comes to the concerns of the potential uses of and harms of that very technology. A major concern with these various video visitation platforms are the elimination of in-person visits, along with financial costs, system outages and glitches that see video feeds being shut down, leaving only a blank screen, old equipment, and other tech issues. When it comes to surveillance and cinematics, a glitch, a violence made ordinary, Or in the case, one case last year, when it came to Home Wave video visitation system, they left their server unencrypted so that call data, including call logs, duration of calls, transcripts or so, even conversations that were between client that should be subjected to client-attorney privilege were made publicly accessible. A dashboard was left unattended with no password protection. So these are some of the various concerns that come with this technology. So in a new paper by Owen, Cobbs, and Craner to be presented later this year at the Computing Human Interaction Conference, the authors examine how surveillance is experienced by family members of incarcerated people when communicating with their incarcerated loved ones. And I'll put the link in the chat later on during our conversation. And one of the things that many of the things that the authors call for, but one of them is increased transparency. And this call for transparency is especially important, particularly that in 2019, there was a report that came out in the Intercept that noted that voice prints of incarcerated people were being captured, enrolled, and then stored in a biometric database. So often without people's knowledge or through forced consent or coercion. So voice prints are said to be unique biometric identifiers. Even the voices on the other end of the call were being apparently captured and enrolled in these biometric systems. So biometrics are said to rely on this notion that the body will produce truth about someone, a certain and absolute truth, despite their claims. The idea that the database will tell you who you are, or tell us who you are. And so that this data was then collected ostensibly for voice recognition to confirm who was making the call, or even how many calls that a certain voice received from various prisons or from various incarcerated folks, to then possibly flag that outside caller as a potential risk for activists organizing inside, for example. And so I'm going to close my short remarks here with the work of Sable Lee Smith to get us to think, I guess, creatively and to interrogate how such violences shouldn't be made ordinary. The violences I mean here are the swapping out of in-person visits with video visitation to save time, as Zoom put it in their ad copy. The ease at which Zoom is able to censor when it comes to Palestine, biometric voice prints enrollments, and these sort of ordinary violences. So the piece on the right is Swear It Closes It. It stands about 14 feet high and 12 feet across. And I think of it as symbolic of the prison visitation room. It could mark the threshold between inside and out, if only these simple kinds of distinctions can be made in the carceral spaces that mark, make, and subtend our current governing order. Swear It Closes It marks a space of bodily pat-downs and searches. It seems cold and heavy, like the modular metal tables with their built-in stools found in visiting rooms, bolted together, efficient and durable, but not meant to be comfortable. They're part of the market in prison-grade furniture, sometimes called visitation station furniture or correctional facility furniture, or as one company put it that traffics in this kind of object, justice furniture. In an interview with Kat Herman in Cultured magazine, Sable Lee Smith had this to say: "If you hear the word violence, you think about the images that proliferate in the media. I'm not pointing to that kind of imagery or narrative. What I'm most concerned with are invisible, quotidian, day-to-day type of violence, and what is accumulated of those, and what is the accumulation, of those small, minuscule transgressions in the body over time." Swear It Closes It makes for an imposing archway, the passage which through seems hardly welcoming. But for Smith, it gives us a way to understand the quotidian, the ways that violence is made ordinary. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. That incredibly gives us a lot to think about. But before we get into our conversation, now I'll turn to Ruha, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, wonderful. Again, such an honor. I think you're going to hear that over and over, to be in conversation with Simone, an American artist. I have titled my short reflection, The New Jim Code, Reimagining the Default Settings of Technology and Society. And I want to begin with 3 provocations that connect the various examples I share. The first is that racism and other axes of domination are productive. Of course, I say that not in the sense that it's good in the normative sense, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. Because still today, many people are taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple, in the backwoods and outdated, rather than as innovative, systemic, diffuse, an attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, in the tech industry, forward-looking, productive. In my field of sociology, we often say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary that racism constructs. The second provocation is that race and technology shape one another. Again, more and more people are accustomed to thinking about the social and ethical impacts of technologies, but that's only half of the story, because social norms and values and structures all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply the impacts that we need to be concerned about, but the inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable, which leads to the last provocation. That imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technologies and social orders. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, and social control. So racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination where we have misery for some, monopoly for others. This means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one that's grounded in justice and joy, we can't only critique the underside, that is who these systems harm, but we also have to wrestle with the deep investments, the desire even for social domination. So those are the nuggets. Let's turn to some specifics, starting with a relatively new app called Citizen, which will send real-time crime alerts based on a curated selection of 911 calls. It also offers you a way to report, live stream, and comment on purported crimes via the app. And it'll show you incidents as red dots on a map so you can avoid supposedly dangerous neighborhoods, which is a slightly less racialized version of other apps called Ghetto Tracker and Sketch Factor. So many of you are probably already thinking, what could possibly go wrong in the age of barbecue Becky's calling the police on Black people cooking, walking, bird watching, breathing out of place? It turns out that even a Stanford-educated environmental scientist living in the Bay Area, pictured here, can be an ambassador of the carceral state, calling the police on a cookout at Lake Merritt. It's worth noting too that that app, Citizen, which was originally called the less chill name Vigilante, in its rebranding, also moved away from encouraging people to stop crime, but rather now simply to avoid it. What's most important to our discussion, I think, is that Citizen and other tech fixes for social problems aren't simply about technology's impact, but also about how racial norms and values shape what tools are imagined necessary in the first place. So this is the dynamic that I take up in two new works. The first one examining the interplay between race, automation, and machine bias more broadly as an extension of older forms of racial domination. The second is this edited volume, which looks at the carceral dimensions of technology across a wide range of social arenas, from more traditional sites like policing and prisons, to less obvious contexts like the retail industry, financial and health technologies, and the digital service economy. So now to connect up with our theme of surveillance and cinematics, I want to pause for just a couple of minutes and share a brief clip from the film Sleep Dealers to really get at this issue.
So here's a clip, it's about 3 minutes long. In this scene, you'll see the character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you'll see he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo, sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa. Y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres.
Sleep Dealers also brings to life an idea that inspired the title of the edited volume, that technology captivates, fascinating, charming, bewitching, while potentially subduing and subjugating people. To engage this tension, we have to pierce through the rhetoric and marketing of tech utopianism as we try to understand the duplicity of tech fixes, purported solutions that nevertheless reinforce and even deepen existing hierarchies, from the treatment of workers in Amazon warehouses to the treatment of immigrants by ICE. Technology captivates. Electronic ankle monitors wrapping around the limbs of thousands of people as they await trial or serve patrol. An attractive alternative to cages, more humane and cost-effective than jails, we're told. Tools in this way capture more than just people's bodies. They also capture the imagination, offering technical fixes for a wide range of social problems. Electronic tracking and location systems are part of this growing suite of interventions dubbed techno-corrections. Indeed, these interventions come bubble wrapped in rhetoric about correcting not just individuals, but social disorders like poverty and crime, not just nationally, but globally. These innovations that contain are what I term the new Jim Code. And what I'm drawing attention to with this concept is that technology can hide, speed up, and scale the ongoing nature of social domination and allow it to penetrate every facet of our lives under the guise of progress. With that, let me spend a moment just tracing some of the organizations resisting and transforming the new Jim Code, from the Detroit Community Technology Project to the Digital Defense Playbook. Taken together, this is part of a growing movement of tech justice organizations that are transforming paranoia about surveillance technologies into power, galvanizing communities to take a proactive approach to designing the world they want and need. They're building on a long tradition of data justice, journalists, scholars, activists from W.E.B. Du Bois to Ida B. Wells Barnett. Among these giants is the late legal and critical race scholar Derek A. Bell, who encouraged a radical assessment of reality through creative methods and racial reversals, insisting that to see things as they really are, we have to imagine them for what they might be. So one of my favorite examples, and I'll close here, is what we might call a Bellian racial reversal. And that has to do with the white collar early warning system, a parody project that begins by subverting the anti-Black logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast so-called street crime, the white collar early warning system flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but it includes an app that alerts users when they've entered high-risk areas to encourage, quote, citizen policing and awareness. Taking it one step further, the development team is working on a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design the algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the average face of a so-called criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical when we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices in the real world, including the use of facial images to predict criminality. By deliberately and inventively upsetting the status quo in this manner, analysts can better understand and expose the many forms of discrimination embedded in and enabled by technology. So if, as I suggested at the start, an ahistoric and asocial approach to science, data, and technology captures and contains, that means a historically and socially grounded approach can open up possibilities and pathways, can create new settings, encode new values, and build on critical intellectual traditions that have continuously developed insights and strategies grounded in justice. And my hope is that we all find ways to build on this tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. And American.
Great, I'm gonna screen share.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm also extremely honored to be in this conversation with Simone and Ruha. Their work has been so influential on what I'm doing as an artist and educator as well. Yeah, so I want to sort of frame the work that I'm going to be talking about today through this notion of the wake that I'm taking from Black feminist scholar Christina Sharp. So she says, I've been trying to articulate a method of encountering a past that is not past, a method along the lines of a sitting with, a gathering, and a tracking of phenomena that disproportionately and devastatingly affect Black peoples any and everywhere we are. I've been thinking of this gathering, this collecting and reading toward a new analytic as the wake and wake work. And she kind of talks about this to describe the ongoing, what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, or living within these constructs of systemic racism that continually imperil Black lives. And so I want to have that on your mind as you watch a couple of clips from this film that I'm going to show. This was a film that I created last year, and the title of it is 2015. So I want to bring us to this quote from Jackie Wang, author of Carceral Capitalism. And she says, "The riots and protests in Ferguson, sparked by the murder of Mike Brown and the mass demonstrations ignited by the grand jury decisions not to indict the officers who murdered Mike Brown and Eric Garner mark the pinnacle of the police's crisis of legitimacy. Around the United States and beyond, people are chanting, 'No justice, no peace, no racist police.'" And the reason I place that here, this film that I showed, it's a fictional film that's based off of the use of a real technology, a predictive policing technology that's been used across the United States for at least a decade or so. And in this book, Jackie Wang talks about this idea of a crisis of legitimacy surrounding the police, feeling like because of all the claims on behalf of Black Lives Matter that police are racist, that they don't hold themselves accountable, they are beginning to feel like they don't matter, or like they, in order to be relevant, they need to sort of insist on a reinforced logic of objectivity. So some sort of police science or some sort of neutral way to handle policing in order for them to sort of bring themselves back into a position of having legitimacy. In the film, you see this technology sort of forecasting or predicting where some potential crimes may take place, which is based off of how the software actually works. It doesn't visually look the same, but these types of softwares do use past police data to predict where a crime might take place. And the way it's talked about within the context of these softwares is forecasting or crime forecasting, rather than using the word predicting that we're more familiar with. And again, returning to Christina Sharp, when she's talking about this notion of the wake, she also describes this notion of the weather. And she says, "In what I'm calling the weather, anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies." And she uses this idea of the weather to talk about a total climate of anti-Blackness and continuing to live in what I mentioned earlier, the afterlife of slavery. And thinking about this notion of the weather, or about, many aspects of society incorporating these methods of anti-Blackness, this weather having a relationship to this notion of forecasting, or also prediction, or determining people's potentials in the future based on things that have happened in the past. So then Jackie Wang also says, the rebranding of policing in a way that foregrounds statistical impersonality and symbolically removes the agency of individual officers is a clever way to cast police activity as neutral, unbiased, and rational. So again, in response to this sort of crisis of legitimacy, or something that's also been described as an attack on cops, or a war against cops, their response is to sort of insist on a neutral seeming system, which naturally is a technology-based system. So using predictive analytics as a way to say that they are neutral, or that they're not racist, basically. And as we know, the data that they use is based off of former police activity. So it ends up reproducing or creating a feedback loop of who is criminalized, who is seen as a threat or as guilty of criminal activity. And it also is racially biased because it is based off of the actual police behaviors. Then that sort of gets regurgitated by these algorithms. And the thing about some of these predictive policing softwares is that rather than being based on individuals, are based off of neighborhoods or areas, and they use that as a way to say, again, that they're neutral, that they're not racially biased because they're not targeting individuals. But as we know, different communities and geographies obviously have a direct relationship to who lives in a certain place. The desire for law and order, which is heightened when we are made aware of our corporeal vulnerability to potential threats that are unknowable to us, can be strategically manipulated by companies that use algorithmic policing practices to prevent crime and terrorism at home and abroad. So basically, people feel vulnerable, and these tech companies sort of rely on this feeling of uncertainty about potential harm or threats, which are pretty irrational, but using that as a way to then say why we need all of these algorithms, or we need these predictive analytics, because otherwise there's this potential for an impending threat. And in the film, there's this bit of data that's in the bottom right corner that references CompStat. And CompStat was or is still a policing software that's been used since the 90s. And you could consider it a predecessor to contemporary predictive policing, where it uses comparative statistics from week to week, from year to year on different types of crimes to determine if there's a drop or a rise in crime, and using that to basically determine what kinds of policing needs to happen in the future. And so that's sort of included as a way to tie this other form of predictive analytics that is a little bit lower tech to what is now a predictive policing software. And I'm gonna end there. Thank you.
Thank you. And, I'm really here to facilitate a conversation. So I can start by having a question, but I hope that you will also think of how you want to talk to each other and let me know about that. And also, people that are watching, do add your questions into the Q&A, and we'll work them into the conversation as well. But I think that one of the things that I thought we could start talking about while you think about how you want to talk to each other is this question of invisibility and hypervisibility that I think that your work, American, really points to, right? That there's something about the non-focus on bodies, right? That these, even as that's what's becoming, made hyper-visible within these forms. I think that, we live in a nation where 2.2 or 2.3 million people are incarcerated, that we're used to these, disproportionate amounts of poor people, people of color, indigenous peoples, and in disproportionate is the word that Joanne Barker used last talk with the kind of critique of it, right? Like what would be the proportionate amount of this? But, you know, somehow that there remains people in the United States, and not even the overtly white supremacists, who manage not to see the systems that are working. And I think that this is something that all of you are talking about at your work. So if you want to start American to kind of think about these tensions between surveillance, this technology of seeing, and all the things that people still refuse to see or are able not to see.
Yeah, I think there's many ways to approach this question. I think in much of my work, this concept of invisibility and hypervisibility and invisibility has really focused on a sort of political agency that's granted in controlling one's ability to be seen or be present, how you sort of have a choice in having autonomy over how you navigate virtual space, or over my own name being anonymous or not being anonymous. That's something that I've thought about a lot, or the ability to refuse representation as a sort of means of claiming agency. But I think the way that it resonated with me the most in Simone and Ruha's presentations was just, as you mentioned, the intense like obfuscation of labor and incarceration, and that also is like a dynamic of power and control.
Ruha, do you want to add?
Sure. You know, the phrase that came to mind is from Alondra Nelson's work on body and soul, when she's talking about medical technologies, but also just access to medicine and healthcare. And she describes the dialectic between surveillance and neglect. And so when you have this dynamic of extreme forms of neglect, whether with healthcare or education or other social goods, then there's often a demand for, we'll take whatever we can get. And when you have the discourse around technology, around the digital divide and the lack of access to technologies, then a demand for digital recognition can easily be warped into all kinds of surveillance. And so one way to think about it, we often hear that if you have free access to some technology, it has access to you. And so really thinking about that, the two-sidedness of this. And so again, when we think about Black people around the world, but all kinds of, you know, subjugated populations where the demand for recognition through these technologies is understandable, then often that can be used for an uncritical then association with surveillance and access to these same populations, whether data extraction, whether just being watched in numerous ways. And so I think it's really trying to parse that relationship between being exposed and watched when you don't want to, and the demand to be seen for who you really are on your own terms. That has to be part of the same frame.
That's great. Simone, do you want to add?
Sure, I think I'll add, but also pick up on one of the questions that is in the Q&A around electronic monitoring or ankle shackles, or from the images that we saw in Ruha's presentation, and if that's just, you know, an okay, or isn't it a necessary problem with the justice system, not the surveillance in this case. And I feel like that's, to get to this idea about invisibility, or what is purposely made invisible, is the carceral system. And what it could be an electronic shackle under someone's clothes, or it could be a prison in what has been sometimes called like a failed town or so. And so there was a report that came out a couple years ago. It was called No More Digital Prisons. I forgot the group of people, but it was James Kilmore, Maisha Haynes, and others. And that was important to situate a technology such as this as an extension of the carceral state. That is one that could cost $250 a month to pay for, people paying for their own detention fees. So while that may be invisible, the home itself becomes a site of incarceration. You know, if you're like Martha Stewart or so, and you have a large yard to walk around while you're under an ankle monitor, that might be something. But for most folks, that perimeter might make it difficult to go and pick up your child from school, go outside and have a smoke, throw out the garbage, all of these ways in which these types of ordinary violences are made invisible. And I think reports and work such as these are important, to highlight that there has to be a refusal of even these types of technologies that some might see or understand as, well, at least better than incarceration, as opposed to seeing it as a satellite of carceral spaces.
I think, Ruha, you had something.
Yeah, it really picks up on Simone's point about what gets hidden. And it refers back to that amazing film that American artists shared. And there's a couple of reflections on that. One just struck me this time seeing it, the kind of auditory assault, the siren, the noise, and that while this patrol is looking for crimes out there, it's engaging in the kind of assault on people's ears and bodies as it moves through space. And that gets written out of the story about what and who is harming and causing harm, right? And so even just sitting here, kind of the really assault on one's mental health, growing up in that situation where it's the constant noise of being watched is something that people ultimately embody. So that's just one initial reaction. Then going to your sort of framing for us the source of these predictions, that is an algorithm that initially took shape in the context of trying to predict earthquake aftershocks, is applied, just transferred from this kind of the idea of natural disaster to social disaster, as if criminality and criminalization is not a social and political process. We're just going to predict this natural thing that happens out there. And so the language of forecasting, it reminds me that to think also about the intellectual foundations of these technologies. Oftentimes we start the story of big tech surveillance and policing surveillance with the technology companies or with the state apparatus, when in fact thinking to the intellectual roots implicates the academy, implicates what kind of knowledge we produce in the academy. So in this case, it's a Canadian anthropologist at UCLA who creates this company that then gets sold to all these police departments, this algorithm. And what's so interesting when you look both at the website and the kind of origin story of Predpol, Predictive Policing, this company, is, it's an interdisciplinary, adventure. It's bringing together criminology, anthropology, computation. So if we, again, implicating the academy in our buzzwords, understanding that interdisciplinarity is not a straightforward good. And then in this case, it becomes enrolled in this carceral imaginary, and it provides the legitimacy for this entire, all these tentacles that we then saw, a very, visceral example of through the film. And so I just want to bring the role of the academy and knowledges into this as part of the story of what we're talking about. So we're just not pointing our critical lens out there at big tech or out there at the carceral state, but in here in our own backyard in terms of the universities.
Yeah, I really love that, and that's definitely something that I'm trying to communicate whenever I'm talking about this notion of policing and police science is the role of the academy and then tech companies and the military and all of these things kind of coming together to create these different things. And it's the same thing that creates many other aspects of technology. Just thinking about the way so many technologies are derived from the military, I think is also something that I'm trying to keep on the surface. But something that I wanted to return to was what you were saying earlier about the sound, and particularly in the sound in the first clip of the film. The police officer drives down the street blaring their siren, and clearly they don't get out of the car and apprehend anyone, but as they're going down the street, they're like different people are recognized or targeted. And then it says crime deterred. And it's not really clear to the viewer what exactly is happening. And that's intentional. What I was sort of thinking happens in that moment is that they're really just declaring their presence. They're like scaring people, saying, I'm here. And just merely by doing that, supposedly the crime is, reduced, the chances of crime are reduced. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with that. And I think this question you raised about who's inflicting violence, I think is extremely poignant in that situation. And it also kind of made me think about not only the use of sound by the police, but the use of light. And I know it's something that that Simone has talked about as well, the use of police lights in different neighborhoods as a means of surveillance, but also causing violence. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure, because it ties into the work that you do with police departments or critiquing policing around New York City. And there's Dr. Joshua Scannell talks about this, about the role of omnipresence as a kind of a technology of violence that not only is about light, like high intensity floodlights being flooded into people's home, but it's also a sound campaign of violence, because a lot of these, portable generators, the smell, the continuous hum, disrupting people's sleep patterns. And so you're right about using sound and noise and even smell as a form of violence and announcing a presence. And so surveillance is not just about what is screened, but also, the various other senses that are assaulted through it as a mechanism of control, or at least attempts to control.
I have to say that we're getting great questions in from what is obviously a really smart audience. And I would say that one of the first ones that came in was from Nick Mirzoff, and he asked about the kind of prevalence of which people are talking about surveillance capitalism. And Ruha, when you were talking about the intellectual foundations through which we're talking, I think that one of the things that I think is interesting about all of you is the careful insistence that we realize that racism prefigures technology, right? That it's the originary source from which technology runs. And this idea of surveillance capitalism detached from issues of slavery and racism that Nick Mirzoff points out to. But I also think that maybe there's a way to talk about racial capitalism here. But that's the other thing we're kind of another foundation we need to talk about.
Yeah, one of the things that a very short part of the book that I was thinking about this is, the idea that Black people already live in the future. And if we understood the conditions in which that Simone documents, that American illustrates, if we took it as seriously as we should, we could see many of the other things. We could forecast the predictions, the predictive policing. We could see it coming because communities have already been experimented upon. They've already been the test site of so many of these, but in many ways, because of that marginality, it becomes a surprise to the mainstream when you have data extraction, when you have surveillance capitalism. And so, understanding that specificity in terms of the experience of different groups can actually give us more insight in terms of seeing things coming, the unrolling of various social orders and socio-technical orders. And so rather than simply privilege the kind of universal theory, once it applies to everyone, understanding that specificity of knowledges can really offer us a gateway and an insight into many of these processes, whether surveillance, racial capitalism, or other dimensions of this.
Did anyone else have anything, or do you want?
For Nick Mirzoff's questions, people can read other books. They can read The Right to Look. They can read Golden Gulag. They can read Sweetness and Power. And I think that there's a lot of branding that goes on and how and what gets critique, and how, what critiques get leverage in a space like academia, in a space like Twitter? Are there various cross connections there? And so I know that Dr. Misroff doesn't always look to the institution, but outside of that to do that type of work. So I think that's a great question.
And I want to talk about that in the context of what Ruha mentioned earlier about technology and race being co-produced, but also something I thought about a lot. Reading Simone's book, how surveillance and race are co-produced as well, and how hard it is to get people to like have those, in their mind in conversation all the time at the same time, because it's really easy, I think, for people to think about technology in this sort of universal abstract way, like, oh, we're all suffering from technology, but it takes another step to understand that race is always a factor in how those things are deployed and how they are enacted and how they behave, and just trying to communicate how much that connection remains, I think is something that I'm always trying to do, but find it hard to do.
That one of the things that we're seeing a lot of questions too are about the tactics that you could suggest to kind of avoid the technologies or to escape the detection. So there's a question from Nicole that says you discussed the ideas of these technologies to monitor. Oh, I clicked down to the wrong one. Let's see, from Heather, is a potential parallel to the white collar early warning tech, the predictive policing tech effectively helps civilian folks predict where and when police are likely to perpetuate harassment and violence. So I didn't read that very well. You see the chances to like take the technologies back or the ways to use them in some other way.
Yeah, there's other corollaries to this too, even outside of policing, ones that aren't simply kind of creative and parodies, but for example, in the context of housing discrimination, and we know about the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which we can put a link to here, which you can think about all of the kind of algorithms and surveillance of tenants and ways of ranking and rating and credit scoring individuals who are most vulnerable in our precarious housing market. But in this case, it kind of flips the lens back on the realtors and back on the real estate developers and looks at their treatment of individuals and families and places the surveillance lens back to those who are monopolizing power and resources. So the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is one of those ways of flipping the lens and thinking about who's watching who. Similarly, there was a great project under the heading Studying Up that was published by some wonderful colleagues in, I believe it was in Medium initially, but there's a paper to go with it where, again, thinking about the way that these systems are used, risk assessment systems are used in our carceral system to decide whether people get a parole, how long, et cetera. In this case, they flipped the lens back to the judges and looked at their record of, deciding if people were going to, be held pre-trial. And then basically were rating and ranking judges based on their past record. And so thinking again about taking the data collection lens and placing it back on those who have power as one way to begin to even just expose the power dynamics behind these systems, which many people have yet to really reckon with.
Somebody wants to talk more about that, but I'll put another question in the mix from Andrew, who asks about Dr. Browne, about your provocation, challenging us to think about the various names used to describe the furniture in prisons, alongside, Ruha, your argument that racism is productive. Is it possible for you all to meditate on what it might mean to furnish an abolitionist future, if we take to furnish, which can also mean to create, to perform, to produce, or to fill space against the forces that furnish the prisons?
That is a perfect question. I really love that one. But you know, when I read it, I was thinking of the work that Ruha does at the Ida B. Wells Justice Lab, and not Ruha, Ruha and her students and what they've you know, created. And so I'm sure that, you know, they have created some, you know, to furnish an abolitionist future, what it might look like structurally as well. I don't want to, so I'll just hand it to Ruha because I know she probably has some examples there.
Yeah, that's what we're working on. And, you know, I mean, the first thing that came to mind, again, I love that question as well. And I feel like, Simone, we could probably hold a whole workshop on that, right? And just like experiment and make things. But I was thinking about not furnish, but fashioning an abolitionist future, which is kind of where I end up at the end of Race After Technology, and looking at, just for starters, these anti-surveillance fashion inventions, whether it's visors or earrings that record or things that you know, sort of hide one's face or one's body. And so thinking about, you know, those types of refashionings of the relationship between social identity and these surveillance systems as one genre of this that's not having to do with actual furniture, but kind of refashioning. And then, you know, I was just thinking about the fact that a lot of times when we want alternatives to surveillance, we do initially, our own imaginary is constrained and we want like different technologies to be the alternative to the oppressive technologies. Like we want different apps or we want other cameras that are looking in another direction. And I think part of expanding our abolitionist imaginary and refurnishing you know, how we think about that is not simply to substitute one technology for another, but to be able to ask whether we need software and hardware to get to whatever ends we want. So there should be an element of real choice where it might not be a technology that is going to help us achieve our goals. And so this element of informed refusal, where we get to have the power to say no, like, we don't need data on this. Why? Because we already know what the problem is. So we don't need to spend millions of dollars collecting X, Y, and Z data to tell us that Black people are going to die earlier and far worse from the pandemic. We could have told you that last February, right? And so the thing about it is that oftentimes we call for more data, we call for more technology about things we already know the answer to. And so data becomes a way of delaying action on acting on what we already know. So for me, part of furnishing an abolitionist imaginary is to say, sometimes data and technology is not the answer. Let us mobilize and act on what we already know based on the mounds of lived experience and other empirical forms of data that already inform our vision. And so I think we shouldn't be captured by simply trying to create new technologies for things when we may not necessarily want or need that.
Mm-hmm. And I think an example of that, I was thinking of, you know, sometimes I think both of us use some of these images around the ways that people who are unhoused cannot find a place to sit or sleep around certain cities with these spikes or these benches that, you know, you can't lie flat on, and the ways that people have created improvised ways to have those, you know, inhospitable benches become a place where someone can rest. And that can be extended to, I think just last week, the city of Austin, some of its police budget, which was partially defunded, was then is said to be going to be put towards, or at least a vote was had to housing, secure housing for people who are, you know, presently unhoused within the city. And so those kinds of, you know, abolitionist furnishing an abolitionist future. It might be a tentative move by the city, but perhaps it is a start at least.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this aspect of abolition that I think was really impactful for me was just understanding it outside of merely the removal or elimination of incarceration or carceral systems, but also how we envision these alternatives and also live them out contemporaneously with those other things going away. And so and a phrase that stuck with me from, I think it's from Mariam Kaba, of a life-affirming institution, and what that looks like, what that means. And so I can think about that alongside this notion of furniture, but also not just furniture, but for me, I've thought about it a lot in the context of an interface, and especially, you know, creating, for example, the interface of the 2015 film, these sort of policing interfaces, which are very much based on military, you know, aesthetic interfaces. And so something for me has been also considering what might an abolitionist interface look like, or an interface, you know, that is life affirming, and thinking about, yeah, how that looks. And I think that that's something that's kind of been informing me at the moment, as I'm thinking about my current work.
That's great. And I would say, I want to kind of hone in on what you said, Ruha, too, because I think that one of the things I've thought about a great deal about the three of you together is the way that you turn towards art and visual culture to talk about these things and to bring them into sight, or however we want to talk about it. And I mean, American, your work is the perfect example of this, right? That there's something about data and facts that are all around us, and yet you're choosing to show it, you know, in this completely different form. And Simone, you know, you brought up Sable's work today, and you repeatedly turn to contemporary art, you know, whether it's Robin Road in South Africa, you know, you evoke different people as you talk about it, and Ruha, you turn to popular culture. So I thought maybe you could talk about that.
I mean, one of the things that motivates me is just a simple idea that the data and the so-called facts aren't going to save us. And so even as someone who's, you know, sort of committed, you know, my life to education and, you know, the social sciences and so on, just kind of eventually coming to the realization that has a place, but it's not the end point. It's not the thing that is going to really be transformative in the end. There's one study a few years ago that kind of hits this home in connection with our conversation here out of Stanford, and it's called "The Numbers Don't Speak for Themselves." And essentially these researchers, they approached white Americans with data, with disparity data, let's call it, about our carceral system, and showed the higher levels of Black people being caged in our jails and prisons, and then asked them, you see the data, are you willing to support reforms in California, the 3 strikes law, New York, stop and frisk? And what the researchers were surprised by was the more the people were exposed to the disparity data, the less likely they were to want to support reforms. They became more punitive the more exposed they were to the data. And so for me, I have to stand back, and I think we all should reckon, you know, with this idea that there's a lot happening besides people just trying to, in a straightforward sense, understand what these statistics are saying or what these disparities mean. And so part of it is to visualize, again, all of the interpretive lenses between, you know, our cognition and the so-called facts. What is happening in this space right here? We might call it narrative. We might call it imagination. We might call it lies, racial lies that we learn and retell about why those people deserve to be there. Why would I change policies to, you know, alleviate those disparities? If there's more Black people in there, they must be crimogenic. And so really standing back from the study and thinking about the fact that we have to be as rigorous about the stories in our culture and that we tell, that we're told, as we are the statistics. The stories matter as much as the data and the statistics, if not more. And part of that storytelling is this visual field, this visual culture that really can work to transform those narratives and interpretive lenses as it relates to this disparity data.
What about you, American?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to also speak about, like, not only just a abundance of the visual, but also, you know, something that I thought about particularly with this film was like how overexposed we are to, for example, images of Black death, you know, contemporary lynchings by the police. And so something that I wanted to do with that film was to not have anything that's, you know, so spectacular, and sort of insist on these other forms of violence that are a little bit more nuanced, or you know, you can see them just within that frame of that interface. And also for me, it kind of connects with something that Simone was saying about Simone was saying about Sable's work, speaking about the quotidian, or the sort of the minor aggressions of these different systems and things. And so not so much focusing on this spectacular thing that's also used as a way to oppress, but also thinking about how these forms of violence are enacted in these more minute ways.
And I think for me, like the role of the artist in thinking about surveillance is like how I actually get it now, like through poetry, through art, through the visual. And they really, for me, you know, trouble the very, you know, methodologies of surveillance, and allow for a way of creating and imagining Black life outside and beyond the surveillance state. And so, you know, of course, you know, the work of Sable Lee Smith that I mentioned, but also Sadie Barnett, Sandra Perry, and so many others. And, you know, I was, to speak a little bit about American's work, I had the great opportunity for American to like take me through your installation at the Queens Museum. And we were there, and there were some kids there, maybe from junior high school or so, and they didn't know that you were the artist that you know, created that piece 2015. And to see those moments of, you're right about the assault of sound, and what that familiarity of what that was for those kids there. But there was also a moment where, not at that installation, where I tried to use your Sandy Speaks chat box. And maybe if you can talk a little bit about that, because it's, I would love to hear some more about that, and maybe I can come back in a little bit.
Sure, yeah. This was a chatbot that I made a few years ago, and it was sort of after Sandra Bland had been killed. And it was basically like prior to her arrest, she had a online video series that she was making where she kind of spoke out against police brutality and sort of her visions for the future, and especially for Black children, and how they might interact with the police and things. And it was called Sandy Speaks, and she would just, you know, go on like Facebook Live or something and speak about it. And then later on, she was arrested, taken to prison, and she died. And so I created this chat bot that was just based on some of the things that she said in this Sandy Speaks series. And I was just thinking of it as sort of a way to continue that conversation that she had created. And also, again, like moving away from this spectacularization of, you know, Black people being killed by the police. And so rather, this piece, it's purely in language, you know, there's no visuality to it really. You just see the text and you see it responding to you.
Can I ask American another question?
Sure.
There's a piece that it says like, I'm blue. If I were redacted, I would die. And this is, you know, a collection of work that you often show with the 2015 piece, where you really are critiquing the very methodologies of police training and police tactics. But you do that through a kind of mashup between Christopher Dorner, who was the, you know, LAPD whistleblower in 2013. There was a large manhunt and everything, and was perhaps killed by some type of drone, or maybe not, but that's the story that's sometimes told. And the Watchman. And this is this moment of like speaking to his Dorner's manifesto. And could you say something about like how your work is structured? I think it might get to that question that Rachel asked at the beginning, you know, through that piece in particular. Yeah,
I mean, I could say a lot. I mean, I wanted to bring these different people together for different reasons, but it was, the show in the whole was sort of, I want to say, poking fun a little bit at the police for wanting to identify as blue, and also the Blue Lives Matter movement, and some laws that have been written that further protect police that are referred to as like the Blue Life Bill or Blue Lives Matter Bill or whatever. And so that's why Dr. Manhattan was there as a literal blue person to give his 2 cents about what it means to be blue. And then Christopher Dorner being this person, this Black man that dedicated his entire life to being a cop, and then was removed from the force for, you know, calling out his fellow officer, and then publishing this manifesto. And I decided to combine those figures in order to speak to the police and critique them for wanting to be blue. But actually, I wanted to ask Ruha and Simone a question, because I have been thinking about, you know, how some of these theoretical concepts they all study enter into art. And I guess I want to know, like, you already spoke a bit about what you see as like the potential or role for art in using these things. But I guess also if there are examples of artworks that you feel like maybe have done things that you wish your work could do but couldn't do, or like where you feel the position is for art to continue that conversation.
Yeah, you know, one of my favorite artists, and his work is on the cover of Captivating Technology, Mansell Bowman. I think one of the things, and I, you know, there's so many artists that I follow and who I love. But one of the things that I think that I'm drawn to his work and others is imagining futures in which Blackness is the norm. It is there. It's not something that it doesn't feel reactive. It feels very, very generative, and that this is, you know, what we need to expect. And also the blending of the technological, the biological. So it's not like cyborgs in the traditional sense, but there's a kind of seamless blending of technology on our own terms. It's often a characteristic of it. And so it's not resistant to technology, but it integrates it in a way in its own terms. And so that's, I think the art represents that, but it's also what I see as qualities of movement building and transformation, is that it's not simply anti-science or anti-technology, even though people cast it as such, but it's really trying to excavate the power dynamics underneath the techno status quo, and then thinking about how we transform that, and staying open to some forms of technology we may decide to keep. But again, another artist I'll just throw out there is Natrice Gaskins, who does this algorithmic art, these portraits of people, again, thinking about her idea of techno-vernacular creativity. And so again, that's another concept, and I'll put a plug in for her book because it's coming out with MIT later this year. Everyone should look for it. I think you can pre-order it soon. Techno-vernacular creativity and innovation. And so she's one of these people who has one hand in the technical and the algorithmic, and then the artistry, and blending it in her own terms for her own, through her own vision of what she wants to create in the world. And so that's some of the work I'll link to in the chat as well.
Are you going to take it too?
No, I think I know my lane in terms of like what artists I wish my work was like, my limitations. But you know, all of the artists in Barring Freedom, I think, have been so you know, I don't want to say cliche inspiring, but they've been really helpful in how to think through all of these, the concept of looking and watching back and resisting and challenging and creating. So thank you.
Well, and thank you. I'm really glad that we got to talk about the blue works, I have to say, and that of course are on view at San Jose Museum of Art, which should be reopened pretty soon. But I think we should take one more question out of this big stack of questions that I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, about that brings up the ideas of data trauma and data healing. Because I think that the question of what, that Jake's question about what a reparative framework might look like in changing our relationship to data and technology is something that we keep talking around and about, right? But almost every question is like, what is the tactics that we take? And you've talked to it a lot and talked about it through art, through these different technologies. But if you want to do kind of one more takeaway on that, I'd love to hear it.
Reparations, I think, for these harms and these traumas, I think, are key. You know, and the money is there from the harm of, you know, harassment that takes place on Twitter, from the kind of either it's you know, radicalization or misinformation through, you know, these various platforms, to the harm that comes from like electronic monitoring. You know, the images, the brutality that that Ruha showed us earlier. So I think reparations, I think, you know, is the key. That the healing is not like, you know, on these communities that are harmed to take responsibility, but, you know, people have to pay up.
Amen. I love that, co-sign that. Also, I just will note for Jake's question, the book that I plugged in the talk, the Digital Defense Playbook, is one of these that people use to facilitate in communities what individuals can do to try to be, again, more vigilant. But again, I want to go back to what Simone says. I think that is not a reasonable burden to place on individuals, that we have to constantly be aware of where our data and who's watching us. I think that, you know, that itself is a recipe for premature death, the kind of racism related vigilance and surveillance related vigilance. And so, yes, we need strategies and tactics as like the ones outlined in the Digital Defense Playbook, but we also need the ability not to be harmed in the first place so that we don't have to heal. It's a kind of preventative approach. And so what does that look like? It looks like the kind of organizing and movement building like what's happening in Detroit against their green light surveillance citywide program. It's like the Stop initiative in New York. It's like Stop LAPD spying in LA, and all kinds of efforts going on in the Bay. And so thinking about putting a stop to the kinds of harms that are technologically mediated or otherwise, so that we don't have to then create whole new frameworks for data healing in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think not having to be subject to the same exploitative, you know, strategies of data valence that we have been, it would be immense, and it shouldn't necessarily be on us to, you know, create that possibility. But another thing that I thought of, which is not a super clear answer, but I was just thinking again about how hard it's been for me to sort of imagine interfaces that aren't based off of the ones that, you know, have been showed to us and given to us for so many years, that we've been using the internet and computers so widely. And I think I want to say part of data healing is like being able to imagine an alternative of technology that's entirely different than what we've been prone to using and what we've been told is the norm. And I think in that, understanding some other values that are often left out of commercial high technology, certain communal qualities, or means of operating, such as slowness, or just ways of operating with technology or with one another or with data that really counter all of the ways in which we are brought into this capitalist productive mode of being, which really stems from the legacies of colonialism and slavery, et cetera.
I really look forward to seeing your abolition interface. I have to say, yes, we all have to hold accountable and demand reparations and look at who's profiting from this and figure out what to do next. But thank you so much. I really feel like this conversation could have gone on for much longer, I have to say. This was great, and I really appreciate you all. But now Gina is actually going to join us again to introduce the music video, which is also fantastic. So that will bring us out. Hi, Gina. You're muted.
I am indeed. Thank you so much. It was an amazing conversation, and it's true, we could go on, but hopefully our video for today will help us with some of our data trauma and move us toward data healing. It comes from Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, and it's called "You Ought to Be Ashamed," Expanse. You Ought to Be Ashamed, music and lyrics by Porter Granger. Expanse, music and lyrics by Cecile McLaurin-Salvant. Some of us have been dreaming of expanse. Some of us have been slowly making plans. Expanse. A place where we can stretch our toes. Expanse. The kind of vastness where a body doesn't know which way to go.
You'll be sorry. You just wait and see. Just you wait and see. Wouldn't treat a dog the way you're treating me. Way you're treating me. I'm a total nervous wreck with a millstone round my neck. I'm as blue as any girl can be. Don't be surprised if you see me hanging from a tree. Hanging from a tree. You ought to be ashamed, shamed, ashamed, shamed of what you've done to me. But I will be the same, yes, the same. You can bet that I will always be. You can dodge me and neglect me, treat me like a hound, but I'll be waiting for you when you come back running round. You ought to be ashamed, shamed, ashamed, shamed of what you've done to me. Some of us have been dreaming of expanse. Some of us have been slowly making plans. Expanse. A place where we can stretch our toes. Expanse. The kind of vastness where a body doesn't know which way to go. Some of us have been dreaming of expanse. Some of us have been slowly making plans. Expanse.